Hi, this is Roger, thanks for dropping by, and this is Viewers Orchid Questions number 9, part 2. Video was far too long for one continuous video, so I've split it into 2, and this is the rest of the clips for number 9. Oh, here's a nice quick easy one. This is Corbin from, what's the channel, Plant Basics. What was my first ever orchid and where did I keep it? I bet if you asked everybody in the world what their first ever orchid was, they're going to say Phalaenopsis. You might get a few exceptions, but not many. And so was mine. And for a while, probably 30 years odd, all I ever had was a few Phalaenopsis dotted around the house. I had nowhere else to keep them. Now I know I had a white Phalaenopsis while I was at college, but I don't for the life of me remember when I got it. Did I get it while I was at college or did I take it with me? I can't remember. But I mean, I was at college from 19 to 22, something like that, age-wise I mean, so it's quite a long time ago. And that was my first orchid, and it lived on a shelf in my room at college where should have had all my college books, but I'm not a big reader. So the only books that were up there are ones that I had to read as part of the course, and it sat on there. So it got reasonable light, I would think. Did I worry about what light it got? No. Did I know anything about that plant? No. So that was my first one and where it lived. I know it was still alive when I finished at college because a girlfriend at the time stayed up in London to do an extra year, and I just stayed in London. We got a place, and I know I still had the orchid then, so I still had it at that point, but whether I still had it when we moved back down to this area, I don't remember. I don't remember. So that was that one. That would have just been a white Phalaenopsis hybrid. It certainly wouldn't have been the species, which I've forgotten the name of. There is a white Phalaenopsis species, might be Schillerina, oh, I can't remember, but it's basically the basis of so many hybrids. It's an absolute star, basically. Right. Janice Upton asked about, this is sort of part of the question from before, it has similarities anyway, when we talked about the Oncidium types that refuse to stay down and want to climb. There's cotyledons like that too. There are other types of plants that will do that. It's not just the Oncidium types. But when you get aerial roots and the plant is climbing out of the pot, the same logic applies. If you've got good high humidity, those aerial roots will survive. They're probably not going to survive very well in dry air without a lot of help, which is constant spraying, just trying to keep them hydrated, to such an extent that you might start getting a bit annoyed with the plant because it's giving you extra work. The other part of this question though is, what do you do when you repot a plant that's gone over the side of the pot with all those aerial roots? Do you put them in the media? It's a yes and no answer. Again, if you've had really humid air, the roots are acclimatized to being moist even though they're in the air. So they'll probably take to going in a media, as long as it's not packed tight. They used to have an air around them, don't forget. It's the change that messes roots up. You know, like I've said, if you buy a plant that's in tightly packed sphagnum moss that shouldn't be, so you wash all the moss off and put it in some nice chunky bark and the roots die. And you think, why have you died? I've just given you what you need. It's because you've made a major change and they can't adapt fast enough. Some plants adapt easier than others. Some really don't like those changes. So you have to do the changes steady, a bit at a time perhaps. Come from moss to a mix of moss and bark. And you might need to repot more often. Then after one season perhaps go to bigger bark still with some moss. Yeah? Or perhaps take the risk and go to your mount, because if you're going to go onto a mount you'll probably have some moss over the roots. But these aerial roots, if you're going to pot them, they're going to need to adapt. And some of them won't. Some of them will die and die back. So again we go back to, when's the best time to repot a plant? When you've got new roots growing. And then if there is some root loss, it's not as dramatic. Because if you lose your root system and there ain't no new ones coming, you may lose the plant. So that timing is quite important. But it's the adaptation of the change that's the big deal. I mean, I had a brassica that was mounted, that was growing like this and heading off of the mount, quite dramatically as well. It was about 6 inches away from the mount. None of the latest 2 growths had any roots in the moss or on the bark. And I took that off and potted it, and it took about 2 months to die. Just gone. Lost its root system and just gave up. So, you take your chances, but some aerial roots will take to going in a pot, and some plants won't have it. You can't have a list of those that do and those that don't. It's not far off trial and error. This is a good one, actually. I don't think it's been asked before, and I don't think I've dealt with it before, not directly. RockDoc 2174 says, can you overfeed orchids? Now, you'd expect that to be a yes or no answer. Unfortunately, it's another yes and no answer. Orchids will only take in what they can, which is based on what they need. And there's like a little gauge that goes full and I can't take in any more. So if I put my Vanda in the bucket, yeah, there comes a point when those roots can hold no more. Now, they're not making big decisions like saying, I'll let that bit of water in, ordinary water, because I don't want any more feed. It just goes in. The plant will take in what it needs, if available. Yeah, so we're not talking about underfeeding, we're talking about, so depending on what you've got, whether you've got a mount or a pot, what the media is, blah 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 blah, if you overfeed, what you're basically saying is there's leftovers around the plant that haven't been used. In a lot of cases that won't do any harm, but in some cases, if it's really overcooked, you'll get root burn from the salts. The excessive salts, because bearing in mind a lot of plants in our head, we're thinking, right, wet dry cycle, wet dry cycle. What happens to that excess fertiliser when the moisture's gone is it becomes super concentrated because it's lost the water element. So it's like super strong, and it's on the roots because they can't now absorb it. There is no water with it to allow it to go in. So you get root burn. It can be damaging. How do you know when you're overfeeding? Some plants are very nice. Things like Masdevallias, they'll start getting brown or black tips to some of their leaves. They're basically saying, I'm not happy, I'm getting far too much food. So you get a warning shot. Lots of other plants won't do that. What happens is often nothing, and you never know. Depends how much you're overcooking it by. If you overfeed, you're wasting time, effort and money. How do you know if you're underfeeding? You probably never will, because it's very difficult to underfeed if you feed lightly and very regularly, because you're mimicking what would happen in nature. There aren't many orchids that are epiphytes that get heavy feeding in the wild. It just doesn't happen. Unless it's an accident, literally. You know, you've got orchid like here in the fork of a tree, and at the next fork of the tree, there's a big dollop of monkey poo, and every time it rains, some of that washes down all over the roots. That would be getting too much food. That just doesn't happen often enough to worry about. So overfeeding, some plants will let you know, and the brown tips on the leaves, or root tips going brown, dying back. Brown staining on nice white roots, that can be a sign, and that can also be signs of other problems, which I'm not going to go into today. So you can overfeed. If you underfeed, you may get weaker plants, but I mean, I know a guy who grows Masdevallias. If you ask him how often he feeds, he goes, oh, I don't. I keep forgetting. When did I last do it? Oh, must be months ago. And all his plants are wonderful. Yeah. So it's difficult to say. Again, different types of orchids are renowned for liking different amounts of food. Masdevallias, Draculas, very, very light feeders, allegedly. I've never tried overfeeding them or bumping it up. I just keep it low because that's what everybody else does and it seems to work. And I don't like pushing my luck. You know, if a plant's doing reasonable, sort of okay, most of those plants that I've just mentioned for me are never going to do brilliantly because they can't stand the heat in here, which is now getting excessive because all the kit's off. I'm starting to get overheated. So it is possible to overfeed orchids, but not up through the roots to damage the plant because they won't take it in. Yeah? You can get circumstances where the nutrients get sucked out of the roots. Under certain conditions, I'm not going to try and explain it because I'm not sure I even really understand it, but I know I've read it at times. And it's to do with the density. So the concentration of the nutrients on the inside of the root compared with what's on the outside, leaching happens. And I think it's when, I can't remember, but there are times when the nutrients are taken out. Sciencey stuff, not worth worrying about, quite honestly. The answer is, don't waste your fertiliser. It's often not that cheap, you know, depending on how specialised you're going for. And think of the type of orchids. It is said that Vandas and Phalaenopsis are definitely high feeders. They like, I'm not sure they like excessively high feed, but what they like is a constant supply at a reasonable level. You have to stop and ask yourself, my Phalaenopsis has finished blooming and I've taken the spike off. It's not growing any roots and it hasn't started any new leaves yet. You know, why would it need a high level of feed? You still go back to the same principle. What's the plant doing? Is it growing? If it's growing, it needs feeding. How much is it growing? Stonking away? Bump it up. One little new growth? Not so much. And remember that what you give your plant is not the only food it gets. Never forget photosynthesis. Sugars and things are being created through that process. They are an essential part of processing the nutrients that you put in. They go together. So again, a plant with no leaves ain't going to be doing a lot of that, is it? And a plant with no leaves that you're trying to recover, quite honestly, don't need any food. Not until something starts happening. They say don't feed a sick orchid. At what point is it not sick anymore? It's starting to grow, showing some signs of some new roots. Yes, it might still be poorly and still classed as a rescue and being recovered, but at least it's doing something. Now it needs some help, but not a lot. So there we go. And if you ask every orchid grower you can get your hands on or get sight of how they feed their orchids, every single one of them will give you a different answer. So there is no one way. So the chances are what you're doing is probably okay. You know, I'm sure you could find others that are very similar to the way you work, because there is no one way. Right, so that's cleared the decks. And the other question that I wrote up there for me, i.e. my question to ask to give an answer, I'm going to do is the Sunday chat. So, because I think it can be elaborated on enough to actually fill in with that. Now we've got some serious trouble, because I haven't got any note pages left and I haven't got a new notebook yet. So I've got nowhere to write anything. Oh, I could use a sheet of printer paper, couldn't I? Temporarily. Anyway, I hope some people got something out of that. There's quite a varied set of questions there about different sorts of things. And don't forget, those are my answers. You could ask that same set of questions to a different grower and possibly get a different set of answers. But this is based on what I've got, what I know, and where and how I grow. And that will vary the answers dramatically. If this place from these doors forward didn't exist, those answers wouldn't be the same. Firstly, I wouldn't have the same orchids. And if I only grew orchids that side of these doors, the answers will be based on those orchids and those conditions. Yeah? So again, it's another one of those, you ask a different set of people the same questions, you may well get a different set of answers. So those are my answers. And thanks for keeping the questions coming in. They're only coming in at a trickle, but they're still trickling in. It's good stuff, and we will have viewers' questions and answers when there's enough to make a session of it. Otherwise I'll just hold them. As soon as I see them, I write them down. Otherwise they'll just get lost in the comments. Just they're so far back from what I'm doing currently. There's only so far I'm going to scroll back. So that's that. Hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time. Gosh, it's really hot, is it, in here? It's nearly 30 degrees. We need some kit on. I'll see you next time. Thanks for dropping by.